Well, welcome back. We're just going to start right cold out. The last time we were lecturing, I had to stop at the middle. I ran out of time and I didn't get to cover everything that I had planned to cover. So I had gotten to the date 1619, and I told you that was a very important date in American history. And I'm going to start at that point for today's class. The thing that happened in 1619 in Virginia was that a Dutch ship arrived and unloaded a cargo, and I think I told you that a lot of the trade of Virginia was carried on by Dutch ships because the main product of Virginia was tobacco, and the big market for that was in the Netherlands, where there were the Dutch masters who were manufacturers of cigars. So this was a ship that had come from Africa, and it brought in a cargo of people, of Africans, who were in chains. And we know about that. We know the date, we know the name of the ship, we know the number of Africans aboard. We have some information from the records of the cargo ships that came and went. And local government in those days kept track of those things as they do today. So we know quite a bit about this, and we know that now there were some Africans who had come to North America. They were brought here against their will. But although some people may not agree with me, we don't really know their status. And the big question is, and it comes down to a very major and important question, were they considered slaves, or were they considered indentured servants? And there are ways in which both slaves and indentured servants are the same. Neither of them were considered free. They were both obligated to work for somebody else so that they had something in common. But there are some important legal differences, and we don't know about that. The records of their status are a little bit limited. They're a little bit unclear. We know that for nearly 100 years, there were other Africans in Virginia. And we know that they were not free in the same sense that white landowners were free, but we don't know the details and the specifics of their legal status as to whether they would be considered indentured servants or slaves. So I have to take a minute now to talk a little bit about the whole idea of indentured servants. That's part of the whole story of English settlement in North America that I haven't talked on so far. I've been explaining to you that the people who came from England to America were overwhelmingly from the English middle class, the farmers, the small farmers. An English word for them, I don't think I'd used this before, an English term for them was to call them yeomen. That was a legal status in England that meant basically small farmers, independent landowners, but not qualified to vote because they didn't have 50 acres of land. That was the people who basically comprised English settlement in North America. And they came here usually at their own expense because they had resources in England that they could use to pay their passage and to support themselves while they were getting settled. And they came here because land was so much cheaper in America that they could sell their land in England, have enough money to pay for their passage and pay for their expenses, and still acquire land in America. They could get more land and still have money left over because land was so much cheaper in America than it was in England. And that's just simply a matter of the law of supply and demand. There was just a lot more land in America, so it was a lot cheaper. And that was the bulk of the people who came from America, or came to America from England. But in addition to that, there was a significant number of other people who were in a different category. And I haven't talked about those so far. And we don't really know how many people fell into this category. We know it was a lot, but it was still a minority, maybe a third, a fifth of the people. We don't know for sure. And it's kind of frustrating historians because we don't have really good records on these things. So we can't really tell. But these were indentured servants. And what that meant was that you signed a contract, an indenture, it's a contract, to work for somebody for a period of years. Usually they would be like from 5 to 7, depending on a lot of other factors. It changed over time, it changed over all sorts of other circumstances, but approximately 5 years or so, maybe a little bit longer, depended on how old you were and a lot of other variables. But you would sign a contract and you would agree to work for somebody for that length of time. And then during that length of time, you would not be considered a free person. You could not come and go as you wished. You couldn't quit your job. You were obligated to work for that person. And at the end of that time, you would be free. Sometimes you might even acquire some land. Sometimes the indenture, the term of the agreement, provided that when your indenture was up, when your term of service was expired, that the owner would give you some land. That was part of the deal, sometimes. Probably wasn't that common, but that was part of the deal in some cases. In some cases, the owner might get a head right for bringing you over. Remember, the deal of a head right was that for every person whose passage you paid, you got 50 acres of land. So if you bring a person over as an indentured servant, if you pay for their passage, and that's the deal, that's what's the trade-off. That's what people are doing. They're getting passage to America in exchange for 5 years of labor. And if the law was such and it changed and it was different in different colonies and different at different times, so it's real hard to generalize. But sometimes the master, the person who is hiring this indentured servant, would get a head right because he's paying for your passage. So the head right deal is he gets 50 acres of land. And then sometimes, not always, and we don't know all the details, but sometimes the indentured servant would automatically get that land that the owner had gotten as a head right. So this was a way, and it probably was not very common, it was not the majority of cases, and there were a lot of exceptions to it, and a lot of people didn't do it, but it was possible that you could be homeless, you could be desperately poor in England, but by selling your labor for, say, 5 years, you could get passage to America, and you could even get 50 acres of land. So you could become a landowner, you could get your freedom, something that would not be possible to you in England. Now that may not have been the majority of cases, but certainly it did happen, and that was certainly something that people did. Probably much more common was that when a person's indenture was up, he's now free, he or she, because there were a lot of women indentured servants. They could do whatever they wanted, they could come or go, but where are they going to go, what are they going to do? They probably just ended up staying as workers, laborers, on the farm where they had been an indentured servant. That probably was the norm, but we're not sure. There's all kinds of other special cases and other special situations. Certainly sometimes there were women indentured servants, and some of them ended up marrying their master, and sometimes masters in a society that was predominantly male found that this was a way to get a wife, was by hiring an indentured servant and then marrying her if things worked out. So there's all kinds of cases, but people were held as indentured servants, which meant that during that time they are not free, they are forced to work, but when the indenture is over, legally they become free. Now they probably, that means they were no longer obligated to work, but they didn't own land. Sometimes they could, sometimes not. We don't know. Well, it may have been that these Africans were also indentured servants. And as I said, it's frustrating to historians, and you may see people who insist that they were slaves, people who insist that they were indentured servants. And the true answer is, we just are not sure. The records are just too spotty, too ambiguous. One of the things that people have looked at is wills of somebody who has some servants, and they leave the servants, but it's not clear if they're left as property. It's not clear exactly if they actually are an asset that he can pass on. The person who dies can pass on to his heirs. It's the wills are incomprehensible. They don't make sense. You look at it and say, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that the African there was a slave or an indentured servant? We can't tell. It's confusing. So we don't know. We know that there were Africans working in Virginia and other southern colonies. And we know that they worked primarily in the South because much of southern agriculture was labor intensive. It required a lot of labor. A key crop, of course, for many years was tobacco, and tobacco was very labor intensive. I mean, you had to raise tobacco pretty much like one plant at a time. You had to harvest the leaves one leaf at a time. So you had to do a lot of tending of the leaves and of the plants and so forth. Very high demand for labor. Other crops in the South were rice, which was also in the deep South, not so much not in Virginia, but down in South Carolina or Georgia, where rice requires a lot of water, but it also requires a lot of labor to harvest the rice products. And then another one, which we'll have to talk about some more, and it could only be in the very deep South, but a big product was sugar. And sugar was labor intensive. Harvesting sugar by hand took a lot of time, a lot of labor. So there's a great demand for labor in the South. And we know that much of that labor was provided by Africans. Some of it was provided by indentured servants, and we know that some was provided by Africans. There were also Africans in the North, and in the North they did all kinds of labor. Africans were used in almost everything you can think of. They were used in farms. They were used to raise other products of northern agriculture, such as wheat and corn. They were used in cities to work as laborers. They worked on ships as sailors and longshoremen and so forth. They worked in wood mills. They worked in grain mills. They did almost everything that you can think of in the North. But the numbers were not great. There was not that much of a demand for labor as there was in the South, where agriculture was labor intensive. Northern agriculture was much more dependent on grain, which is large crop, and you just go out with a big scythe and start cutting it down, and it's not as doesn't require as many people. So the demand for hired labor was just not as great in the North. So there are fewer indentured servants in the North, and there were fewer Africans. And as I say, throughout the South, and especially looking at Virginia, the largest colony, the first and still the largest, we just don't know throughout much of the 17th century what their status was. But over time it became clearer and clearer that people of African descent were different from Europeans who were indentured servants. Africans were considered property. Now, that didn't happen all at once. It was not clear at the early years, 1619, when the first Africans arrived. It's not clear that they were property. It's not clear that they could be bought and sold. Over the next 80 years, it became clearer and clearer. The historical record is less and less ambiguous. The laws are very clear. The laws are very adamant about insisting that people of African ancestry are property. They can be bought and sold. They have no rights. Their children are also slaves. You're a slave for life. And you exist to serve the needs of your master. And you exist to serve the needs of the larger community. Your obligation is to serve, sort of everybody. Anybody can order you around or so forth. You have no rights, you have no freedom, you are property. And this is what I kind of alluded to when I was talking about the status of Indians in Spanish America and Mexico. I mean, Indians were also forced to work. They were forced labor. And they were not free, they could not leave, they could not go. And they were forced to work for life and so forth. But they were always defined as human beings. And that was not the case in Anglo-America. People of African ancestry were defined as property. And just as a rough approximation, we can say by 1700, that's now clear. It's finally been clear that slaves in Virginia and in the South were there as property. They were there at the discretion of their masters, and they were there to serve for life, and their children were going to serve for life. So, yes, in Mexico, Indians were forced labor. In North America, you couldn't get the Indians to work as forced labor. The Indians would just run away, and you couldn't do anything about that. So we started using Africans instead, and they were forced labor, and in that sense, the Indians of Mexico were no different from the Africans of Virginia. But the big difference is that the Indians of Mexico were always considered humans. Low-level humans, oppressed humans, yes, but humans. Africans in North America were property, were an asset. It's like owning an animal or something. It belongs to you, you can do with it what you want. And there were very few rules limiting the power of the master over the slave. The master could pretty much do whatever he wanted, and even if it involved the loss of life of a slave, well, it's his property, he can do with it he wants. It's stupid to destroy an asset, but it's your asset, so if you want to destroy it, you can. And that became established in the South, as I say, by 1700. And it's a slow evolution that Virginia moved to sort of clarify the status of Africans as property. And this accompanied a decline in the number of indentured servants. One of the reasons why Virginia probably started to move to define Africans as property was because they were having more and more trouble enticing people to come from England and work as indentured servants. And the reason is pretty clear. One of the things that's happening in England throughout the 17th century is what we call the Industrial Revolution. England was starting to industrialize. Factories are starting to appear in England. Probably the single biggest industry was what we would call the textile industry. It was also called the woolens industry because the raw material was wool, and they were using wool for clothing. And they had mills that would produce the textiles, hire people at very low wages, bare survival levels. People working in these industrial towns that are starting to appear in England had a very hard life. The life expectancy was very poor. sanitary conditions in those poor neighborhoods was abysmal. Diet was horrible. Life was very, very short. Life was hard. And so industrial England was a place of great suffering and hardship for the people who were there. But it provided a survival. The homeless rate is starting to decline. People are going into these industrial jobs. Manufacturers are fortunate to have a very large labor supply at low cost because people were so desperate for work. So homelessness is actually starting to decline, and the number of people who were willing to be indentured servants was starting to decline. It's a little interesting to me that would happen because conditions in industrial towns were so horrible. But more and more people were looking at the terrible life as an indentured servant versus the terrible life as an industrial worker. And more of them were deciding that, well, life as an industrial worker is horrible. But at least I can stay here in England, I can stay with family, I can stay in my community. And life as an indentured servant is also horrible, so you don't have a good choice. Well, more and more people are opting to stay in England, and so the number of indentured servants was going down. And that's a slow, gradual trend, but there was one event that was just a specific event that sort of accelerated the whole transition. In the early days, the slave trade between England and Africa, and England and all of its colonies in Africa, was limited to one company. There was a company that had a charter, and this was the way England ran things. We've talked about chartered companies. They chartered a company called the Royal African Company, and it had a monopoly of the trade in Africa. And then in 1695, England took away that monopoly. They altered the charter of the Royal African Company, so there was no longer guaranteed a monopoly of all trade between England and Africa. And that opened up the door to competition for the slave trade, which resulted in a decrease in the price of slaves. So it made slavery a lot more attractive. So more and more, and that was a big event. That took place in 1695. And that changed things, and now the African slave trade increased because the one company no longer had the monopoly. So that made slaves more abundant and more available and cheaper. So that also encouraged the establishment of the slave trade. So certainly by the 18th century, slavery had become well established in America. And slave labor was the norm on many large farms, sometimes called plantations, but the word plantation was used generically. But more and more, slavery was the norm. In English colonies, more of the South, although it existed in the North, but it was much more common in the South. And this now provides the labor supply for the South. And we'll be talking more about slavery as time goes on. I want to talk about another topic, so I'm sort of switching ground here in the middle of class. I want to talk about the issue of local government. And let me take you back to the beginning here. The first colony, as you know, was Virginia. And Virginia was run by a company. And it was run as a business. And that meant that it was run by a board of directors who were stockholders, the investors in the company. And they elected a chairman or whatever. And that ran the company. It was run as a business. And the people who were settling there were there as employees of the company. They were working for the company. And as I explained earlier, and we've talked about, that didn't work. People didn't want to work for the company. People didn't work for the company. The whole idea of having a business to do this, and supposedly to do it by bringing over homeless people to help solve the homeless problem in England, that's not working. What replaced it was the headright system and the idea that Virginia is going to become a land of small farmers who work for themselves and not the company. So the company was failing as a business. The business model was a failure. And I talked about one of the guys who tried to save it. That was Sir Edwin Sandys, and what he came up with was the idea of the headright, which actually was what was the key to the survival of Virginia. That's what made Virginia work. It just meant that the company didn't get anything out of it, and the company eventually went away. The company's charter was taken away in 1623. The charter was canceled. No, 1624. England canceled the charter, which is a difficult thing to do legally. Charters are supposed to be perpetual. That's the whole idea of a charter, is that it's forever. But England took away the charter, and the company dissolved and disappeared in 1624. Well, Sandys introduced the headright as a way to save the company, and that worked. It didn't help the company, although it helped the colony. But he had another idea that also caught on. He looked at this and he said, why is the company doing so poorly? And there were a lot of reasons, and he actually had several ideas about other things, and he had a whole bunch of ideas that I'm not even going to get into. But one of his ideas was to note that there was really bad relations between the settlers in Virginia and the people who ran the company, all of whom were basically in London. And and the people who were making the decisions, the people who were setting the policies, the people who were making the rules, were the investors and their elected representatives in London. And communication was poor. People in London didn't know what was going on in Virginia. People in Virginia didn't feel that the people in London understood them, that they knew what was happening, and they were right. So there's really bad relations, and one of the problems that this guy Sandys noted was that people in Virginia hated the company, and that's not a good relationship. If you're going to have a successful business, he could figure out that it's not a good deal to have a business in which the employees hate the boss, hate the company. So he said, well, what we should do is let's get some input from the settlers. So in 1619, there's that date, in 1619 he set it up that the settlers who owned land, and there were a lot of the people who were successful people in Virginia were the people who had become individual landowners one way or another. He said that they could elect representatives to some sort of a council, would have a meeting, and that at that meeting that they could express their thoughts and their ideas and their resentments against the company, and send it to the company, and they could look at it. So he's doing what's a kind of a smart thing to do from a strictly business standpoint. Find out what the workers want and try to meet their needs, see what their needs are, see what their thoughts are, and try to improve relations. It's important to have good relations between management and labor. And Sandys is management, and the company's board of directors, all of whom are London investors, they're management, and the people who work and live in Virginia are labor. So this meeting took place in 1619, and they had an election, and the people that were elected got together and they talked and they drafted a letter to the company, to the officials in London, and they said, here's what we think and here's what we want. And and I've seen that letter or a copy of it, and it's a little hard to understand because most of it deals with tobacco and the marketing of tobacco and how you have to have the ships come in and all these deals, and unless you're familiar with the tobacco trade, you can't understand it. But there's a couple things in there that you can get that didn't exactly relate to tobacco. Most of that is because that's what they care about. That's what they do. That's what everybody does. Everybody's a tobacco farmer, so that's what dominates their lives. But one of the things that he said was, instead of having this be a one-time thing, that it's just going to happen once and be done, let's do it regularly. Let's have a meeting every year. Let's have an election every year, elect representatives to come together and have a meeting like this once a year. And we can meet for a couple of days, and we can have an ongoing communication between labor and management. Labor in Virginia, management in London. And they also said we should set it up that any rule, policy, work rule, or anything like that, any of the things that management does would also have to be approved by this council, so that labor would have sort of a voice in running the company. And it didn't express that way, but that's what it amounts to in modern terms, that the labor would also be involved in management of the company. They'd have a voice in running the company. So that report went back to Sands, and frankly, he didn't know what to do with it. He didn't really understand, what are those guys talking about? I mean, this is a business. The workers don't run a business. And that seemed to be what they were asking. And so he didn't know what to do. So he didn't do anything. And then the next thing you know, he was out as the director of the company. He had been the treasurer, but other stockholders didn't like him, and so he was voted out. And other management came in and so forth. Then the company's charter was taken away, and in 1624. So now the company's not there. So who's in charge? Well, the king's in charge by default, just because there was nobody else. So the king is running the company, and he doesn't know what to do. And then in 1625, he died. King James I, who'd been the king all along, had died. And he was replaced by his son, Charles I. And Charles I came in, and he doesn't know what to do. But he said, wait a minute now. He says, I'm the king. I'm going to run this company. But then things happened in England that were so more far-reaching than anything about Virginia. Frankly, Virginia is not that important to England. I mean, we talk a lot about it because in this class that's what we talk about. But for people at the time, the whole business of Virginia is really a sidelight. It's really a minor part of what's happening. The king had many other things that were going on in England, in Western Europe, that were far more important than diddly-do Virginia, which nobody knows about or cares about, and it's just a little tiny bunch of people over there, a couple hundred people over across the Atlantic, and who knows and who cares. So he just sort of dropped it and just didn't care. And all this time, these guys in Virginia had been meeting. Now, who allowed them to do that? They just did. Who gave them any power? They just took it. They were acting as the local government of Virginia. They were doing what governments do. They didn't do very much. Government was not very active, but they did such things as set up a court system. They appointed the judges to the court. They adopted regulations on the trade. Trade is very important to manage, to deal with the Dutch merchants who were coming in and buying the tobacco, and the deals of how that goes, and the rules about the size of the barrels and all this other stuff. The details of that trade were being regulated by these guys. They were acting as a local government. They eventually adopted a name for themselves. They called themselves the House of Burgesses. And that was the word Burgess was a word from England. They just used it. They knew it from English experience. And it was just a term that was sometimes used as for local government officials. So they just started calling themselves that because they were local government officials. And the reality was, the company, it had originally been a company, it had been a business, and the company's gone, and what's taken its place is the king, but the king really doesn't know or care about this very much, so people in Virginia are running themselves. They've got their own local government, and they are acting as government. And they continue to do so for a couple hundred years. We'll see what eventually happens. But they just kept on going year after year, same thing. Nobody in England noticed, nobody cared. They're making their rules for their own colony. Now, that's Virginia. Talk about the second colony, Plymouth. Remember, they came to America on a boat called the Mayflower. While they were on the Mayflower, they adopted a little agreement among themselves. We have a copy of it. It's a document. I'm not sure where it is. It's in the original one is probably in some archive or museum in Massachusetts or somewhere. But they called it the Mayflower Compact. It was an agreement that they all signed. And by they, who do I mean? Not a trick question. I mean the adult white male heads of household. There were some white males there who were servants, and there of course were women, but it's the white male heads of household sign the Mayflower Compact, and they agreed to sort of act as a governing body. They agreed that they're going to have a local government for their settlement in America, which became Plymouth, and they're going to have their own government based on the Mayflower Compact. And so we've got it in the second colony. The third colony then was Massachusetts, which remember started out as a company. It's like a business. It's the same thing as in Virginia, and it's run by the Massachusetts Bay Company. And that's like the Virginia Company. It's a business and it's got stockholders and so forth. But it's really different from the Virginia Company because many of the stockholders actually came to America. Whereas all the stockholders of the Virginia Company stayed in London, and that was one of the problems of that company. The reason why it was such a failure was because the management was all in England and didn't know what was going on in Virginia. But the management of the Massachusetts Bay Company came to Massachusetts and settled there. And they brought the charter with them, so that they are now, although they're technically an English company, they're now located in America. The company is. And the head of the company, as you know, or as I've told you, was John Winthrop, the largest investor, but he's in America. He's actually there. He's an active governor. And the charter said, this is a common legal term, it said that the management of the company should be elected by the investors, the stockholders. The term that the charter used, and this was just a word that meant an investor, was a freeholder, that a freeholder was an investor in the company. So there's a number of people who are freeholders, that is, they are investors in the company, who also came to America. But they're a small part of the total population. There are only those few investors who are the company. Most of the people who are there at their own expense, and they're there to have their own land, and they do, and everything like that. But they're not part of the stockholders. They're not part of the government of the company. The company is a business and it's run by its investors, called freeholders. Well, a bunch of them were really unhappy about that. They were unhappy about the fact that the decisions for the settlement was being made by the Massachusetts Bay Company, which consisted of John Winthrop and this small inner group of investors called freeholders. So they came to John Winthrop's house and they said, we don't like this situation. We don't like the fact that there's just a few of you who are making the decisions about running the company, and the company is the government. And John Winthrop said, oh, you know what? I mean, he This is one of the amazing events in American history, and I don't even know I think we know the exact date this happened because Winthrop kept a diary, and we know a lot about what was going on because of his diary. And so I think we know the exact date. I don't have it in my head, but people came in and they protested. And he said, "You know what? I just got God has just sent me a message. The word freeholder means anybody who owns land. We've been interpreting the charter wrong. We've been interpreting the word freeholder to mean just the investors. Oh no, it's everybody who owns land, which basically means the people of the colony. So all of a sudden the local government is transformed from the stockholders elected by who elect it was called the general court. That's a little confusing. The word is general court, which confuses people because that word court we think of as a judicial body. It's not. This is a governing body. They just use the word, and I don't always like to introduce the word because it confuses people, but I thought I'd go ahead. So they called it the general court, and that's the governing body of the company. Well, and it's elected by the stockholders, but now by Winthrop just reinterpreting things and just having a inspiration, it's become a governing body of a colony, and it's become the local government. So now we've had the first three colonies, they all have local government chosen by the people who live there. People meaning the white male landowners. And actually we don't need to say white male landowners, we can just say the landowners, because only white males could own land. So if you're taking notes, you can just write down landowners, but if it's just for point of clarification, you might want to add the adjectives white male, but it's not necessary because it's implied in the word landowner. But those are the people who are going to run the colony now, and they become colonies with their own local government. Now I'm not going to go through all the other colonies, but every other colony, one way or another, the details are a little bit different. Sometimes there were disputes and one issue or another. But eventually, every colony, long-term, had a local governing body elected by the quote-unquote people, white male landowners, and running the colony. Some people will say, some historians say, the word colony is almost kind of misleading. These aren't really colonies in the strict sense. They're like self-governing provinces. They're like settlements of English people here who elect their own government to govern them. And that was true of every colony. And this worked because nobody in England really cared. Nobody in England objected to this. The King of England, who first of all doesn't have absolute power in England. I mean, I was telling you in the last lecture about how he's lost power to Parliament. Parliament really has the final say in England. So the king is not all powerful there. He's not an absolute ruler in England, and he certainly is not an absolute ruler in America, which is clear across the ocean and of little interest to him, of little concern to him. It's clear across the ocean, and he doesn't care about that. He cares about, his domestic politics. He cares about wars with France and Spain, and he cares about all kinds of other things. On his list of priorities, the colonies in North America are real low down, so he's perfectly willing to just let them have their own local government. A term that historians use for the way England ran their empire was the phrase salutary neglect. Salutary neglect. That meant neglect. You know that word, salutary neglect, means they just ignored it. They just neglected it. And that was true. People in England just ignored the American colonies. But the adjective salutary means healthful, means positive. The colonies thrived. Everything went well. People came over. They could get land. They could produce products. America had abundant natural resources. eventually the dream of the Virginia Company came true. There was a wide range of products being produced in America. There's a lot of land. There's a lot of other resources here. There's a lot of timber. There's some mineral resources. There was some iron for helping to make modern implements. There's a lot of fishing resources available. There's a great demand for fish in Europe, especially in Southern Europe and Catholic Europe. There's a big demand for fish. Americans produced a wide range of products. The economy prospered. England left us alone, and we did well. The only thing that England cared about, the only thing that anybody in England cared about, was to get back to the original question of why are you going to have a colony? What's the purpose of the colony? And we talked about this at the very beginning. And, the answer was, I may have not have phrased this, but the answer was to make money. For Spain, making money was a simple matter. First of all, Spain lucked out, and this was not really something that they planned. They just got lucky, and it was there. There was a lot of gold, so you take gold back to America, and then you get rich, and that's fine. You make money that way. In the long run, the main purpose was to have Indian labor working for you, and producing all kinds of things, and engaging in all kinds of economic activity as forced labor, and that's how you make money in Spanish America. In French America, you make money by trading with the Indians. You trade for fur, and fur is very cheap in America, very expensive in England or in Europe. So you take the fur from America and you take it over to Europe and you sell it at a huge profit, and you make money that way. That's the way you do it. For England, we're going to get rid of the Indians, and we're going to have Americans come in. People are going to come in and settle on the land and start producing things. And then they're going to trade for it. They're now going to sell those products to markets mostly in England, but also throughout much of Europe. Other parts of Europe have a demand for some American products. And so the way you're going to make money here, if you're people in England, you're going to make money from the trade. And that's the trick is, and this is sort of what the Virginia Company eventually figured out, and if they'd had a little bit more time, they might have gotten it to work, and the company might have survived if they'd been able to last a little bit longer, and if they'd started out with the head right, instead of starting out with this idea of having everybody go over and work for the company. If they'd started out with the head right, they might have made it work. People in America produce all kinds of agricultural and other natural resource products, timber, fish, meat from other animals, some iron later. They found iron. And eventually the England's also going to get into the fur trade, and that's another issue because that's going to set up a rivalry between England and France, but we'll get to that. But producing fur, and then you take it back to England or Europe, and you make a profit on the trade. You make a profit as a middleman, and that's where the big money is. It's the trade itself. It's buying things in England or in America at a low price and taking it to Europe and selling it at a higher price. And there was a wide range of products eventually that we started doing. It started out, it was only tobacco. But then people started producing a wide range of other agricultural products. Grain would be sort of a generic term for a lot of them. We could lump them all together as grain. That would include wheat, corn, barley, rice from the south, a lot of grain production. I mentioned sugar. We're going to have sugar in only in the deep south, but that's always a big money maker. Americans are producing a lot of goods and selling it to England. And this all fit in with an economic theory that was widespread in England called mercantilism. Mercantilism. And that was the prominent theory that drove England. And that's what England cared about. England cared about mercantilism. They don't care about running the colonies. They're perfectly willing to let these colonies have their own local governments, because that doesn't bother them. What they want is to be able to implement policies of mercantilism. And what mercantilism said in the larger picture, mercantilism said that the government of a country should run the economy in order to produce wealth for the country. The government's job was to control the economy, control economic activity, in order to produce wealth for the country. Now, how do you produce wealth? Well, we've talked about that a little bit. The easiest and most obvious way is you go over to America and you find gold and you steal it and you bring it back. And that's what the Spanish did, and that worked well for them, but only for a short period, only for a limited period of time, and only because they happened to run into an area where there was gold. That's not going to work for England because there is no gold. But that's one way to do it. It's just to bring money over. The other way is, and this is what English mercantilism said was the key, the way to make money, the way to make, in the bottom line is to get gold, is to have more exports than imports. This is the trick. You export stuff, you import stuff, you trade for it, and that trade balances out. But if you have more exports, then the other countries with whom you're trading, they don't have enough imports to sell you, so they have to make up the difference with gold. Economists call that a favorable balance of trade. That's the trick. That's the goal. Mercantilist theory says have a favorable balance of trade. And you have more exports than imports, and what it comes down to, the bottom line is, the countries that you trade with, since they're not importing goods to you, they're not selling you as many goods as they're getting from you, they have to make up that difference with gold, with money. And that's the way to get gold. That's a long-term, solid way to do it. Not the easy, dumb way to do it, which of just stealing it from someone, because eventually you steal it all and then it's gone, and then what do you do? So England mastered this idea of having a favorable balance of trade. So what you always want to do is you want to encourage people to produce stuff that you can sell, that you can export, and you discourage people from importing. You try to keep people from not importing anything into your country. The goal is to minimize imports, maximize exports. So, you try to do this, and there's ways to do that. One of the simple, obvious ways is to tax imports. Those are called tariffs. So tariffs become a standard tool of mercantilist economic policy. It's a very basic, elementary, but very successful way. You just tax imports, and that discourages them, and that's what you want to do. You want to discourage imports. And so you tax them. But the problem is, what if there's a product that you want, but you can't produce it in your own country for some reason or another? You don't have a resource, the weather isn't right, the soil isn't right, there's something wrong, and there's something that you want, and you can't produce it. But you need it. So what do? You have to import it. And this is a dilemma that mercantilist theory faces. There's, what are you going to do about a product that is essential to your country, but that for some reasons you can't grow or produce or manufacture, whatever? Classic example, sugar. Sugar was one of the driving forces of international trade in those days. Everybody in Western Europe wanted sugar. Everybody knew that sugar was the key to manufacturing donuts and a healthy diet. So there's a great demand for sugar. And sugar does not grow in the climate of Europe. It requires a long growing season, and they don't have it in Europe. So you can't produce it. So you've got to go find it someplace else. You've got to go somewhere else in the world and find a place where you can grow sugar. And from the earliest days of European settlement in America, much of this interest was fueled by the demand for sugar. One of the reasons why Columbus wanted to go off to Asia in his first voyage. I mean, everybody talks about he was trying to improve trade with Asia. He was trying to find a way to trade with China. That was certainly very important. But he was also looking for a place where he could grow sugar. And so when he did find instead America, he found it down in what is now the Dominican Republic. That was where his first settlement took place on his second voyage. And what did he do there? He was growing sugar. I mean, that was the key to the whole Spanish initial element in the Caribbean. They hadn't even found Mexico yet, but they were looking for a place to grow sugar. And sugar was from day one a very labor-intensive type of agriculture, so that led to a demand for slavery. So very early on, Spain started bringing slaves from Africa to the Caribbean. They didn't have to bring them to Mexico because they could rely on Indian labor in Mexico. But in much of the Caribbean, the Indian population had been very small to begin with, and it was quickly wiped out by exposure to European diseases and whatever. So sugar is the big product in the Caribbean, a slave labor product. And it started with Columbus, but eventually France got into it. France's main colony was Haiti, and England got into it. So England started growing sugar in places like Jamaica and Bermuda and Barbados, some other small islands throughout the Caribbean, and that was important. Those sugar-producing colonies of the Caribbean were important to the Spanish, the French, the English, eventually the Dutch, even the Swedes and the Danes got into the business. They all had colonies on some of those islands throughout the Caribbean, and they were all growing sugar, and they were all relying on slave labor. And that was what was important to England. So that's what's driving the English economy, is the need to have colonies in a southern climate, in a tropical climate, which means the Caribbean, using slave labor to produce sugar. And Virginia is growing what? Virginia is growing goddamn tobacco. You can't grow sugar in Virginia. There's no gold in Virginia. What good is it? Well, frankly, it's not good for anything. It's kind of a loss. And that's why England isn't that much interested in Virginia. You can't grow sugar there. There's no gold there. So who needs it? Who wants it? So from the standpoint of mercantilism, which is what England cares about, Virginia, at least as the time, for many years, Virginia is the only colony. It's a loss. It's a loser. So there's no great interest in it. And frankly, that's why England is perfectly willing to ignore Virginia, let them trade with the Dutch, who cares? It's not anything that we need. We want sugar, and we want other products that we can't grow here. We can grow sugar I mean, we can grow tobacco in England. We don't need it. It's bad stuff anyway. The king doesn't like it. Let's forget about it. So Virginia is a loss, and it's ignored. Well, we'll stop here because the time is up. But we'll start in the next lecture, we're going to say, we're going to start in 1660, when England is going to finally say, well, let's see if we can salvage something from this flop of a colony from Virginia and these other colonies in North America, which are not really helpful, are not really beneficial to us, but let's see if we can find some way to have them become useful, and we'll deal with those efforts in our next class.